What happens when the most powerful being in the universe discovers that absolute power means absolutely nothing without someone to share it with? When Empress Zarathel, ruler of 1,000 star systems and commander of fleets that could reshape galaxies, finds herself questioning everything she's built after encountering a single human who refuses to bow? This is the story of a cosmic queen whose empire spans the known universe, whose word can extinguish stars or birth new worlds, yet who finds her greatest challenge not in conquering new realms, but in understanding the rebellious stirrings of her own heart. Sometimes the smallest acts of defiance can topple the mightiest of thrones, and sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one pointing a weapon at you, it's the one who makes you want to be better than you ever thought possible. In a universe where humans are considered nothing more than primitive curiosities, one woman's refusal to accept her place will set in motion events that will either destroy the greatest empire ever known, or transform it into something the cosmos has never seen before. The crystalline spires of the Eternal Palace stretched into the violet sky of Dominion Prime, each tower a testament to the absolute authority of Empress Zarathel. From her throne room, positioned at the apex of the central spire, she could see the sprawling capital city that served as the beating heart of her galactic empire. Ships the size of mountains floated between the towers like metallic fish in an endless ocean of air, carrying tribute, reports, and the constant flow of information that kept 1,000 star systems functioning under her rule. Zarathel herself was a vision that had inspired both worship and terror across the galaxy. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, her body was a perfect fusion of organic elegance and technological enhancement. Her skin held the pale luminescence of starlight, while intricate neural pathways glowed beneath the surface like living circuits. Her arms moved with fluid grace, each capable of independent thought and action through the biomechanical implants that had long since replaced her original Valerian physiology. Her eyes, once the standard purple of her species, now blazed with the gold of compressed star matter, allowing her to see across dimensions and perceive the quantum fluctuations that governed reality itself. She had not always been a ruler. Born on a minor colony world in the Outer Rim, Zarathel had clawed her way to power through centuries of calculated moves, strategic alliances, and, when necessary, overwhelming displays of force. The galactic commonwealth that had existed before her rise had been a sprawling democracy, inefficient and corrupt. She had dismantled it piece by piece, replacing chaos with order, replacing debate with decree. Where once there had been 100 squabbling species each pursuing their own interests, now there was unity under her singular vision. The throne room itself was a marvel of engineering and artistry. The walls were composed of living crystal that responded to her emotional state, shifting from deep blue when she was contemplative to brilliant white when her anger flared. The floor was a single sheet of transparent aluminum suspended over a three-dimensional map of the galaxy, with each star system represented by a glowing point of light. Red lights indicated worlds currently in rebellion, yellow showed systems requiring attention, and the vast majority glowed a peaceful blue, indicating worlds that had accepted her rule and prospered under it. On this particular morning, as she did every day, Zarathel was reviewing reports from across her empire. Her 4 hands moved independently, processing data feeds from a dozen different sources simultaneously. Trade disputes on the Outer Rim, a minor insurrection on a mining world in the Kepler sector, requests for additional defensive fleets from systems near the galactic edge where unknown threats still lurked. Each decision she made would affect the lives of billions, and she made them with the cold efficiency that had made her the most powerful being in known space. Admiral Thexvar, her chief military advisor and one of the few beings in the universe who could approach her without formal announcement, materialized in the center of the throne room as his transport beam completed its cycle. The massive Carathian stood nearly 7 feet tall, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming with military honors and neural interface ports. Where Zarathel ruled through a combination of fear and genuine competence, Thexvar commanded through respect earned in countless battles across the galaxy. "Your Imperial Majesty," he began, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones typical of his species, "the survey of the Sol system has been completed. The initial reports were accurate. There is indeed a species there that has achieved nuclear capability and primitive spaceflight." Zarathel didn't look up from her data feeds immediately. New species were discovered regularly as her expansion fleets pushed further into unexplored regions of the galaxy. Most were either too primitive to be of interest or were quickly integrated into the Empire as client species. Classification? Unknown, Majesty. They call themselves humans. Bipedal, carbon-based, individual lifespan of approximately 100 standard years. They have achieved faster-than-light communication but not faster-than-light travel. What makes them interesting is their rate of technological advancement and their social structure. Now Zarathel did look up, her golden eyes focusing on the Admiral with the intensity of focused starlight. In her 300 years of rule, very few species had been classified as unknown. Most fell into established categories: warrior cultures like the Corathians, intellectual species like the Valerians, hive minds like the Zentari Collective, or one of a dozen other recognized patterns. Explain. Thexvar activated a holographic display that materialized between them, showing a blue-green world orbiting a yellow star. They are technologically inconsistent, Majesty. They have primitive nuclear weapons capable of destroying their own planet, yet they also have quantum computers that rival our own technology from 50 years ago. They have mastered genetic manipulation but still use chemical rockets for space travel. Most puzzling, they appear to be a species in constant internal conflict, yet they cooperate on massive projects that span their entire planet. The display zoomed in to show the night side of the planet, lit up with the geometric patterns of cities. Zarathel studied the image with growing interest. The distribution of lights was unlike anything in her database. Most civilizations showed clear hierarchical patterns, with massive central cities dominating smaller settlements. This planet showed thousands of major population centers with no apparent central authority. What is their governmental structure? That's where it becomes truly unusual, Majesty. They don't have one. They have nearly 200 separate governmental entities on a single planet, ranging from democratic confederations to absolute monarchies to something they call corporate oligarchies. They are constantly in conflict with each other, yet they also cooperate on projects involving climate, disease prevention, and space exploration. Zarathel stood from her throne, her full height impressive even in the vast space of the throne room. She walked to the edge of the crystal floor, looking down at the galactic map beneath her feet. A new point of light had appeared in the outer spiral arm, marking the Sol system. How do they resolve disputes between these governmental entities? A combination of economic pressure, diplomatic negotiation, and military action. What's remarkable is that they've developed weapons capable of ending their entire civilization, yet they've somehow avoided using them for over 8 decades. Our xenosociology experts believe this represents a previously unknown form of evolutionary pressure that has created a species simultaneously prone to violence and capable of restraint. The Empress was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. In her experience, species fell into predictable patterns. Those with strong hierarchical instincts were easily conquered and integrated. Those with strong independent streaks could be managed through pliant relationships. Hive minds were either absorbed or eliminated depending on their compatibility with imperial goals. But a species that was simultaneously divided and unified, violent and restrained, primitive and advanced, didn't fit any known template. What is the recommendation of the Integration Council? Standard protocol, Majesty. Make contact with the dominant governmental entity, demonstrate superior technology, offer the benefits of joining the Empire. Admiral Corex believes they will integrate within a standard year once they understand the advantages of imperial citizenship. Zarathel turned back toward her throne, but something made her pause. In 300 years of rule, she had personally overseen the integration of hundreds of species. The process was so routine that she rarely involved herself beyond reviewing the final reports. Yet something about these humans intrigued her. Perhaps it was the novelty of encountering something that didn't fit established patterns. Perhaps it was simply the scholar in her, curious about a new form of intelligent life. I will handle this integration personally. The admission seemed to surprise Thexvar. His exoskeleton shifted color slightly, a sign of confusion among his species. Majesty, surely a standard integration team would be sufficient. There's no indication this species poses any threat to imperial interests. That's precisely why I find them interesting, Admiral. A species capable of developing planet-killing weapons yet choosing not to use them suggests a level of restraint that might prove valuable. I want to understand how they think before we integrate them. She walked back to her throne, already planning the mission in her mind. It had been decades since she had personally left Dominion Prime for anything other than major military campaigns. The day-to-day management of the Empire consumed most of her time, and she had grown increasingly isolated from the species she ruled. Perhaps direct contact with a new form of intelligence would provide insights that could benefit the entire Empire. Prepare my personal ship. I want a small fleet, nothing that would be interpreted as threatening. Scientific vessels, one light cruiser for protection. I'll take a minimal crew and observe these humans directly. Majesty, the security implications. Zarathel's eyes flared brighter, and the crystal walls of the throne room shifted to a warning amber. Admiral, I conquered this galaxy not by hiding behind layers of security, but by understanding my opponents. If I'm to rule effectively, I need to understand the species under my protection. These humans represent something new. I intend to learn what makes them unique before deciding how best to integrate them. Thexvar's exoskeleton returned to its normal coloration, a sign of acceptance. Of course, Majesty. How large a fleet? Just my flagship and 2 escort vessels. I want to observe them as they are now, not how they behave when faced with an obvious superior force. According to your reports, they're already monitoring their local space with primitive sensors. A large fleet would alter their behavior patterns. The Admiral bowed, the gesture formally acknowledging her decision even if he still had private concerns. I'll have the ships prepared within the day. Will you require a full diplomatic staff? Zarathel considered this. Standard protocol called for xenolinguists, cultural specialists, military advisors, and integration experts. But something told her this situation might require a different approach. Minimal staff. I want to see these humans through my own eyes, not filtered through the expectations of specialists who will try to fit them into familiar patterns. As Thexvar departed to arrange the mission, Zarathel returned to her throne and called up the file on humanity. The more she read, the more intrigued she became. Their literature spoke of individual freedom and collective responsibility in the same breath. Their history was filled with examples of devastating wars followed by unprecedented cooperation. They had developed philosophical systems that ranged from absolute individualism to collective socialism, yet somehow maintained functioning societies under both extremes. Most puzzling of all, they appeared to be a species that thrived on contradiction. Their greatest technological advances came during times of conflict. Their most profound artistic achievements emerged from periods of social upheaval. They seemed to require challenge and struggle to reach their full potential, yet they also showed remarkable capacity for peace and cooperation when faced with common threats. Looking down at the galactic map, Zarathel felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, genuine curiosity about something other than administrative efficiency. For 300 years, she had focused on the practical aspects of ruling a galactic empire. Strategic planning, resource allocation, military deployment, diplomatic negotiations. She had become so efficient at managing the known that she had forgotten the excitement of encountering the unknown. The next few hours were spent in detailed preparation. She reviewed every piece of information available about human society, technology, and culture. Their mathematical systems, their artistic expressions, their scientific methodology, their social structures. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that these humans represented something genuinely new in her experience of galactic civilization. As the day progressed and preparations for departure continued, Zarathel found herself looking forward to the journey with an anticipation she hadn't felt since her early days of conquest. Then, each new world had been a mystery to be unraveled, a puzzle to be solved. The process of integration had become so routine that she had forgotten the intellectual satisfaction of encountering the truly unexpected. Standing at the great windows of her throne room as the artificial sun set over Dominion Prime, she watched the city lights come alive below. Millions of beings from dozens of species going about their daily lives in the peace and prosperity her rule had brought them. It was a good life, she reflected, but perhaps it had become too predictable. Tomorrow she would leave this carefully ordered world behind and venture into the unknown once more. She would meet these humans and discover for herself what made them unique among the species of the galaxy. Something told her this journey would be different from any she had undertaken before, though she could not yet say why. As night fell over the capital of her empire, Empress Zarathel made her final preparations for a voyage that would change everything she thought she knew about power, leadership, and the rebellious nature of the human heart. The Imperial flagship Dominions will drop out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system 3 days after departing from the capital. Zarathel stood on the observation deck, watching the star she had studied in files resolve into actual light streaming through the transparent aluminum viewports. Even at this distance, she could detect the electromagnetic signatures of the human homeworld, a constant chatter of radio communications that spoke of a remarkably active civilization. Captain HFY, a veteran cetacean officer whose species had been among the first to voluntarily join the Empire, approached with the latest sensor reports. His elongated head and large eyes showed the adaptations his people had developed for life in the deep oceans of their world, and his natural telepathic abilities made him an excellent ship commander. Majesty, we're detecting significant activity throughout the system. The humans have permanent installations on their moon, several automated probes beyond the orbit of their outermost planet, and what appears to be a space-based telescope array positioned near their gas giant. Zarathel nodded, impressed despite herself. Most species barely manage to establish orbital platforms before achieving faster-than-light travel. These humans seem to be thoroughly exploring their local space despite being confined to sublight velocities. Any indication they've detected our arrival? Not yet, Majesty. Our stealth systems are far beyond their sensor capabilities. However, their monitoring network is more sophisticated than our initial intelligence suggested. They're tracking objects as small as our scout drones at distances that exceed their own technological capabilities by several centuries. This was becoming a pattern, Zarathel reflected. Every new piece of information about humanity revealed another contradiction. They couldn't achieve faster-than-light travel, yet their sensor networks rivaled those of species that had been spacefaring for millennia. How is that possible? Unknown, Majesty. Our science officer believes they may be using distributed processing networks linked by quantum entanglement. The technology exists in our databases, but most species don't develop it until they've had several centuries of experience with interstellar communication. Dr. Veltar, the expedition's senior xenobiologist, joined them at the observation port. Her Alcarian physiology allowed her to process multiple data streams simultaneously, making her one of the Empire's leading experts on alien psychology. Majesty, I've been analyzing their public communications, and I believe I understand why their technological development seems so inconsistent. Zarathel turned her attention to the scientist, genuinely curious about her conclusions. Explain. They don't develop technology hierarchically like most species. Instead of building each advancement on the foundation of previous discoveries, they pursue multiple research paths simultaneously. While one group works on improving their chemical rockets, another group develops quantum computers. While one nation focuses on genetic medicine, another develops fusion power. It's incredibly inefficient, but it means they can make breakthrough discoveries in advanced fields even while their basic infrastructure remains primitive. The concept was almost alien to Zarathel's understanding of technological progress. The Veilarians, her own species, had methodically built each advancement on the foundation of the previous one. The Korathians had focused primarily on military technology before expanding into other fields. Every species she'd encountered showed clear developmental priorities that reflected their cultural values. Why would they develop this way? I believe it's connected to their governmental fragmentation, Majesty. With nearly 200 separate political entities, each pursuing their own research priorities, they effectively run parallel development programs across their entire species. What one group can't achieve, another group might solve through a completely different approach. Captain HFY's large eyes blinked slowly, a sign of deep thought among his species. That would explain their weapon capabilities as well, Majesty. If multiple groups independently developed nuclear technology, they could achieve devastating capability without any single authority being able to control or prevent it. Zarathel walked closer to the viewports, studying the star that warmed the human homeworld. Yet they chose not to destroy themselves. That level of restraint with that much destructive capability is unprecedented in the galactic database. There's something else, Majesty, Dr. Veltar continued. Their literature and historical records suggest they view conflict as a catalyst for innovation. They seem to believe that competition and challenge drive them to achieve more than cooperation alone would accomplish. It's completely contrary to the social models that have proven successful for every other spacefaring species. This was growing more intriguing by the hour. Zarathel had built her empire on the principle that unity and order produced the best outcomes for civilization. The idea that a species could thrive on controlled chaos challenged fundamental assumptions about social organization that had guided imperial policy for centuries. Take us closer to their world. I want to observe them directly before making contact. The Dominions will move deeper into the system, its stealth systems rendering it invisible to human sensors. As they approached the blue-green planet, Zarathel could see the geometric patterns of human cities on the night side, interconnected by transport networks that crisscrossed continents. The day side showed massive agricultural zones, industrial complexes, and what appeared to be enormous solar collection arrays. Population, she asked. Approximately 8 billion individuals, Majesty. Concentrated primarily on the landmasses, with significant populations living on artificial structures in their oceans. They've achieved what appears to be sustainable resource management despite their numbers. Another contradiction. Most species either learned population control before developing advanced technology or exhausted their planetary resources and collapsed. These humans seem to have found a middle path that allowed for both technological advancement and environmental sustainability. Dr. Veltar activated a holographic display showing human population centers. They've organized their settlements to minimize environmental impact while maximizing efficiency. Look at this city. The display focused on a massive urban area that stretched along a coastline. 20 million inhabitants, yet they've managed to maintain natural ecosystems throughout the urban zone. Their transportation systems use renewable energy, their buildings are designed to work with natural climate patterns rather than against them. How did they achieve this? Most species destroy their environment before learning to work with it. Near extinction, Majesty. Their historical records show they came close to ecological collapse approximately 50 years ago. Instead of fighting over the remaining resources, they appear to have cooperated on a species-wide level to develop sustainable technologies. The experience seems to have fundamentally changed how they approach resource management. Zarathel studied the display with growing fascination. The human settlements showed a level of integration with natural systems that surpassed anything in her empire. Even the most advanced worlds under her rule maintained clear boundaries between civilization and nature. These humans seem to have found a way to make the two work together. I want to observe one of their population centers directly. Can we maintain stealth at lower altitude? Captain Yexhai consulted his tactical displays. Yes, Majesty. Their atmospheric detection capabilities are limited to visual observation and primitive radar. We can maintain full stealth down to surface level if necessary. The ship descended through Earth's atmosphere, its hull adapting to the chemical composition and pressure variations with seamless efficiency. Zarathel watched through the observation ports as they passed through cloud layers and approached one of the major human cities. The scale of human engineering became apparent as they flew over structures that rivaled anything on Dominion Prime. But it wasn't just the scale that impressed her. It was the integration. Human buildings seemed to grow from the landscape rather than dominating it. Parks and natural areas were woven throughout the urban zone. Rivers flowed through the city center, their banks lined with recreational areas where humans gathered in groups. Transportation systems moved above and below ground, leaving surface areas available for community spaces. Their social interactions, Zarathel murmured, watching humans move through the urban environment. They gather in groups even when not required to do so. They seek each other's company voluntarily. Dr. Veltar enhanced the sensor display to show individual human activities. Yes, Majesty. They appear to be naturally social in ways that go beyond family or tribal units. They form voluntary associations based on shared interests, beliefs, or goals. Some of these associations persist for generations even when the original members are no longer alive. This was perhaps the most alien aspect of human behavior Zarathel had encountered. Most species formed social bonds based on biological imperatives, shared resources, or hierarchical structures. The idea that individuals would choose to associate with others based purely on compatible ideas or mutual interests was almost incomprehensible. How do they maintain social cohesion with such voluntary associations? They've developed elaborate systems of shared values and social expectations. What they call culture appears to be a collective agreement about acceptable behavior that transcends their political divisions. Even groups that are in conflict with each other share certain fundamental beliefs about individual worth and social responsibility. The ship continued its journey over the human city, and Zarathel found herself studying individual humans as they went about their daily activities. They moved with purpose and efficiency, yet they also paused to interact with each other in ways that served no obvious practical function. They gathered in outdoor areas simply to enjoy each other's company. They created elaborate displays of artistic expression that served no utilitarian purpose. They cared for members of their society who could no longer contribute economically. Their art, she said suddenly. Show me examples of their artistic expression. Dr. Veltar activated cultural analysis displays, showing examples of human music, visual art, literature, and performance. The diversity was staggering. Where most species developed aesthetic traditions that reflected their biological nature and cultural values, humans seemed to explore every possible form of expression. Some of their arts celebrated individual achievement, while other works emphasized collective identity. Some focused on natural beauty, while others explored abstract concepts that had no physical reality. They create art that has no practical function, Zarathel observed. They invest significant resources in projects that serve no survival purpose. More than that, Majesty. They create art that deliberately challenges their own beliefs and social structures. They use creative expression to explore ideas that their societies officially reject. It's as if they use art to think thoughts they're not supposed to think. This concept was so alien to Zarathel's experience that she had difficulty processing it. Art in her empire served clear social functions, celebrating imperial achievements, reinforcing cultural values, or demonstrating the prosperity that came from imperial citizenship. The idea that art could be used to question rather than reinforce social order was revolutionary. Take us to one of their educational institutions. I want to observe how they transfer knowledge. The ship moved to a complex of buildings where young humans gathered to learn. Zarathel watched through enhanced sensors as human instructors presented information to groups of students. But, instead of the straightforward information transfer she expected, she observed something far more complex. They're not just teaching facts, she realized. They're teaching their students to question the information they're receiving. Dr. Veltar nodded enthusiastically. Exactly, Majesty. Human education emphasizes critical thinking rather than information absorption. They deliberately teach their young to challenge authority, question assumptions, and develop independent reasoning abilities. The implications were staggering. Every successful civilization Zarathel knew was built on the efficient transfer of accumulated knowledge from experienced individuals to newcomers. The idea that a species would deliberately teach their young to question and challenge that knowledge seemed like a recipe for social chaos. Yet these humans had not only avoided chaos, they had thrived. Their technological advancement, their artistic achievement, their social cooperation, all seemed to benefit from this culture of constructive questioning. Majesty, Captain Yexhai interrupted her thoughts. We're receiving a transmission from Admiral Thexvar. There's been an incident in the Vega sector that requires your attention. Zarathel reluctantly turned away from her observation of the humans. The responsibilities of Empire called, even when she was engaged in the most fascinating discovery of her reign. What's the nature of the incident? A client species is refusing to comply with resource allocation requirements. They claim the quotas are interfering with their cultural practices. It was the sort of problem that arose regularly in managing a galactic empire. Different species had different needs and priorities, and balancing those needs with imperial requirements required constant attention. Normally she would delegate such matters to sector governors, but this particular species had a history of escalating minor disputes into system-wide conflicts. How long until we need to depart for the Vega sector? The Admiral requests your presence within the week, Majesty. Zarathel looked back at the human city below, realizing she had barely begun to understand these remarkable beings. A week would not be enough time to fully comprehend what made them unique, but it might be enough to make initial contact and establish the foundation for future study. Very well. Prepare for contact with the human authorities. But I want this handled differently than standard integration protocols. Both Captain Yexhai and Dr. Veltar looked surprised. Standard protocols existed for good reasons and had proven successful across hundreds of species integrations. How differently, Majesty? Zarathel considered the question carefully. Everything she had observed about humans suggested they would not respond well to the demonstration of superior force that usually convinced new species to join the Empire willingly. Their history showed they responded to threats with resistance rather than submission. Their culture valued independence and self-determination above security and prosperity. No demonstration of military superiority. No immediate offers of imperial citizenship. I want to meet with their leaders as equals and learn about their civilization before discussing integration. The idea of treating a primitive species as equals was so unprecedented that her officers struggled to process the concept. In 300 years of imperial expansion, Zarathel had never met with the leaders of a potential client species without first establishing the clear superiority of imperial technology and military capability. But everything about these humans suggested they required a different approach. They were not a species that would be impressed by superior technology, because they were already developing their own advanced capabilities. They were not a species that could be intimidated by military displays, because they had already proven they would choose mutual destruction over submission to superior force. If she wanted to understand what made humans unique, she would have to approach them in a way she had never approached any species before. She would have to meet them as an equal, not as a conqueror. The decision felt strangely liberating, as if she was about to discover something new not just about humanity, but about the possibilities of leadership itself. The first contact protocols developed over 3 centuries of imperial expansion seemed woefully inadequate for humanity. Zarathel found herself crafting an entirely new approach as she prepared to reveal herself to the human leadership. Rather than the overwhelming display of power that usually convinced new species to negotiate, she decided on something unprecedented: complete transparency. The message she prepared was transmitted simultaneously to every major human government, scientific institution, and communications network on the planet. No single authority would control first contact, because humans apparently didn't have a single authority capable of speaking for their entire species. People of Earth, her message began, transmitted in every human language simultaneously through their own communication networks. I am Empress Zarathel, ruler of the Galactic Imperium. I come to your world not as a conqueror, but as a student. Your species has achieved something remarkable that I wish to understand. I request a meeting with your leaders, not to negotiate your surrender, but to learn from your achievements. The response was immediate and chaotic. Every human communication network exploded with activity as governments, scientists, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens tried to process the reality of contact with an alien civilization. Zarathel monitored their communications with fascination, watching how different human groups reacted to the same information in completely different ways. Some human governments immediately began mobilizing military forces, apparently assuming the message was either a deception or a prelude to invasion. Others convened emergency sessions to debate how to respond to a peaceful overture from a more advanced civilization. Scientific institutions launched every sensor they possessed into space, trying to locate and analyze her ship. Religious groups offered interpretations that ranged from divine intervention to demonic deception. But what impressed Zarathel most was how quickly humans began cooperating across their political divisions. Within hours of her message, representatives from the major human governments were in communication with each other, comparing information and coordinating responses. Whatever their differences, they seemed to recognize that first contact with an alien civilization was bigger than any earthly dispute. Dr. Veltar monitored human communications with obvious excitement. Majesty, look at their information sharing patterns. Despite having no central authority, they're creating an ad hoc coordination network in real time. Groups that were in conflict yesterday are now sharing critical data about our presence. How are they managing coordination without central authority? They're using their communication networks to create temporary hierarchical structures based on expertise rather than political power. Their space agencies are providing technical analysis, their military leaders are assessing potential threats, their diplomats are drafting response protocols, and their scientists are developing questions to ask us. It's like watching an entire civilization reorganize itself in response to new information. Captain Yexhai looked up from his tactical displays with obvious concern. Majesty, several human military units are attempting to locate our ship using active sensor sweeps. Should we reveal our position? Zarathel considered the question. Standard protocol would be to remain hidden until formal negotiations began, maintaining the psychological advantage of superior technology. But her goal was understanding, not intimidation. Decloak the ship. Let them see what they're dealing with. The Dominions will shimmered into visibility above Earth's largest continent, its massive bulk casting shadows across human cities below. The ship was a kilometer long, its hull composed of living metal that shifted and adapted to environmental conditions. Weapons batteries capable of sterilizing planets were elegantly integrated into its artistic design, while sensor arrays that could detect quantum fluctuations across star systems appeared as graceful crystalline structures. Human reaction to the ship's appearance was immediate and diverse. Military installations tracked it with every weapon they possessed, though their projectile technology posed no threat to Imperial shields. Scientific facilities turned their instruments toward the ship, gathering every piece of data their sensors could provide. News organizations broadcast continuous coverage to populations that gathered in public spaces to watch the sky. But what surprised Zarathel was the absence of mass panic. Instead of the terror that usually greeted Imperial ships, humans seemed to regard the massive vessel with a mixture of awe, curiosity, and cautious excitement. Children pointed at the ship from playgrounds while their teachers explained what they were seeing. Artists began creating representations of the vessel before it had been visible for an hour. Musicians composed songs about humanity's first contact with an alien civilization. They're treating this as a historic moment rather than a crisis, she observed. Dr. Veltar nodded enthusiastically. They seem to have been expecting this, Majesty. Their popular culture is filled with stories about contact with alien civilizations. They've been psychologically preparing for this possibility for generations. Within 6 hours of her message, human leaders had organized themselves enough to send a coordinated response. The message came from a hastily assembled council representing the major human governments, transmitted through their most powerful communication array. Empress Zarathel, the message began, delivered by a human woman whose calm demeanor impressed Zarathel despite the obvious stress she was under. I am Secretary General Helena Chen of the United Nations, speaking on behalf of humanity. We accept your request for dialogue and appreciate your peaceful approach to contact. We propose a meeting at the International Space Station, a neutral facility in orbit above our world. A small delegation of our leaders and scientists would welcome the opportunity to learn about your civilization while sharing information about our own. The proposal was clever, Zarathel realized. By suggesting a meeting in space rather than on Earth's surface, the humans were demonstrating trust while also maintaining security. The space station was in international territory, avoiding the complications that would arise from hosting alien contact on any particular nation's soil. And, by limiting the size of the delegation, they were showing they understood the practical limitations of diplomacy between species. Majesty, Captain Yexhai said, our sensors indicate the space station is quite small and built for human physiology. You would need to modify your appearance significantly to fit inside their facility. This presented an interesting challenge. Imperial protocol called for alien species to adapt to Imperial needs, not the reverse. But Zarathel's goal was understanding, not dominance. Prepare the modification chambers. I'll adapt to their facility requirements. Dr. Veltar looked surprised. Majesty, that would mean reducing your physical stature, limiting your enhanced capabilities, and temporarily disabling some of your technological augmentations. You would be effectively defenseless. I'll retain enough enhancement to protect myself if necessary, but I want these humans to see me as an individual they can communicate with, not a technological demonstration they need to fear. The next several hours were spent in careful preparation. Zarathel used the ship's biomodification systems to temporarily alter her physiology, reducing her height to something closer to human scale and adapting her respiratory system to breathe Earth's atmosphere. She retained her 4 arms, since losing them would have required more extensive modification than the equipment could safely perform, but she minimized the visible technological enhancements that would distract from conversation. As the Imperial shuttle approached the human space station, Zarathel found herself nervous in a way she hadn't experienced since her early days of conquest. Then, nervousness had come from uncertainty about military outcomes. Now, it came from genuine curiosity about what she might learn and how it might change her understanding of leadership and civilization. The space station was a marvel of human engineering, despite its primitive construction materials. Multiple modules connected by flexible corridors, the entire structure rotating to provide artificial gravity through centrifugal force. What impressed her most was the international nature of the facility. Humans from a dozen different nations worked together on the same project, sharing resources and expertise despite the political divisions that separated their governments on the planet below. The airlock opened to reveal 5 humans waiting to greet her. Secretary General Chen led the group, flanked by representatives from major human governments and scientific institutions. Zarathel immediately noticed their body language. Instead of the submissive posture she expected from a less advanced species, they stood with confident dignity, ready to engage with her as equals. Empress Zarathel, Secretary General Chen said, bowing slightly in what Zarathel recognized as a gesture of respect rather than submission, "Welcome to the International Space Station. Thank you for accepting our invitation." Zarathel returned the bow, matching the degree of respect she had been shown. Secretary General Chen, thank you for agreeing to meet. I am honored by your trust in welcoming me to your facility. The humans led her through the station to a conference module that had been hastily converted for the meeting. The space was cramped by Imperial standards, but Zarathel could see the thought that had gone into accommodating her physiology. The furniture had been adjusted to account for her height and additional limbs, and the environmental systems had been modified to maintain atmospheric conditions suitable for both species. As they took their places around the conference table, Zarathel studied the human faces across from her. She had expected to see fear, awe, or the calculating expressions of individuals trying to determine how to benefit from contact with a superior civilization. Instead, she saw curiosity, intelligence, and a cautious but genuine interest in understanding who she was and what she represented. Before we begin formal discussions, Secretary General Chen said, may I ask what you meant when you said you come as a student? Our scientists are eager to understand what an advanced civilization might want to learn from humanity. Zarathel considered how to explain her fascination with human contradictions. In 300 years of ruling a galactic empire, I have encountered hundreds of intelligent species. Each followed predictable patterns of development and social organization. Your species is the first I've found that seems to thrive on contradiction. You've achieved remarkable technological advancement despite political fragmentation. You've maintained environmental sustainability despite massive population growth. You've avoided self-destruction despite possessing weapons capable of ending your civilization. Dr. Sarah Martinez, one of the human scientists at the table, leaned forward with obvious interest. You rule an empire spanning multiple star systems? How do you maintain unity across such distances with so many different species? Through clear hierarchical authority, efficient resource distribution, and the demonstrable benefits of imperial citizenship, Zarathel replied automatically, then paused to reconsider her answer. Though observing your civilization makes me question whether that approach is the only viable one. President James Wheeler of the North American Federation asked the question she had been expecting. Are you here to conquer Earth? Zarathel met his gaze directly. President Wheeler, I could have conquered your world without ever revealing my presence. My ship's weapons could sterilize your planet from orbit, and your military technology cannot penetrate our defensive systems. If conquest was my goal, this conversation would not be taking place. The humans absorbed this information with the calm acceptance of individuals who had already calculated the military realities of their situation. Instead of fear or despair, Zarathel saw something like relief that the question had been addressed directly. Secretary General Chen spoke for the group. Then, what do you want from humanity? I want to understand how you make decisions without central authority, how you maintain cooperation despite constant conflict, and how you've achieved technological advancement through what appears to be chaotic competition rather than organized research. Dr. Martinez smiled, the expression transforming her face in a way that Zarathel found oddly compelling. Those are questions we're still trying to answer ourselves. Human civilization developed organically over thousands of years, without any grand design or central planning. We've learned to work with our contradictions rather than resolving them. But, how do you resolve disputes between your governmental entities? How do you prevent conflict from escalating to mutual destruction? President Wheeler laughed, a sound that conveyed both humor and rueful self-awareness. We don't prevent it, Empress. We've come close to destroying ourselves several times. What saves us is usually the recognition that mutual destruction serves no one's interests. We've learned to step back from the brink, though we sometimes wait until the last possible moment. This was perhaps the most alien concept Zarathel had encountered. Imperial policy was designed to prevent conflicts from developing in the first place, through clear authority structures and efficient resource distribution. The idea that a species could deliberately approach the edge of destruction as a method of conflict resolution seemed insane. Yet it appeared to work for humanity. Their willingness to risk everything seemed to focus their attention on what truly mattered, forcing them to find solutions that served the interests of everyone involved. How do you determine what serves everyone's interests without central authority to make such determinations? Dr. Elena Petrov, a Russian scientist, answered thoughtfully. We argue about it. Constantly. Every human government, organization, and institution is engaged in ongoing debate about priorities, values, and goals. We rarely reach complete agreement, but the process of argument helps us identify common interests and shared values. The concept was staggering. Instead of the efficient decision-making that imperial authority provided, humans used perpetual discussion and debate to gradually converge on solutions that most of their population could accept. It was slower, messier, and less efficient than imperial methods, but it seemed to produce results that had broader support and greater long-term stability. Secretary General Chan leaned back in her chair, studying Zarathel with the same curiosity that Zarathel was directing toward humanity. Empress, may I ask you a question that might seem impertinent? Please do. What is it like to have absolute authority over a galactic civilization? How do you handle the responsibility of making decisions that affect billions of individuals across hundreds of worlds? The question struck Zarathel unexpectedly. In 3 centuries of rule, no one had ever asked her about the personal experience of absolute power. Advisors discussed policy implications, generals reported on military situations, administrators presented efficiency statistics, but no one had ever inquired about what it felt like to carry the weight of galactic civilization on her shoulders. It is, she began slowly, surprised to find herself searching for words, lonely. The word hung in the air of the space station's conference room like a confession Zarathel hadn't meant to make. She saw the human faces across from her process this revelation with a mixture of surprise and something she couldn't immediately identify. Only after a moment did she recognize it as sympathy. Lonely, Secretary General Chan repeated softly. I imagine it would be. When everyone around you is either subordinate or seeking your favor, genuine communication becomes impossible. Zarathel felt something shift inside her, a wall she hadn't realized existed beginning to crack. How did you know that? President Wheeler smiled with rueful understanding. Because we've all experienced smaller versions of the same thing. Anyone in a leadership position discovers that power creates distance between you and other people. They tell you what they think you want to hear, or what serves their interests. Honest feedback becomes increasingly rare. Dr. Martinez nodded in agreement. It's one reason human governments develop systems of checks and balances. When power becomes too concentrated, decision-making suffers because accurate information stops flowing to the decision-maker. The conversation was moving into territory that challenged fundamental assumptions about imperial governance. Zarathel had always viewed the clear hierarchical structures of her empire as a strength that enabled efficient decision-making and prevented the chaos that seemed to plague species with distributed authority. But, how do you maintain unity and coordination with power distributed among so many entities? How do you prevent fragmentation and conflict from destroying civilization? Dr. Petrov leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. We don't prevent fragmentation and conflict, Empress. We've learned to manage them. Human civilization thrives on diversity of thought and approach. When one group reaches a dead end, another group often discovers a breakthrough. When one society faces a crisis, others can provide assistance and alternative perspectives. But the inefficiency, Zarathel protested. The redundancy of effort, the waste of resources on competing projects, the time spent on debate that could be used for action. Secretary General Chen smiled. Yes, our system is incredibly inefficient if your goal is to implement a single optimal solution. But what if there is no single optimal solution? What if the challenges facing civilization are too complex for any individual or authority to understand completely? The question struck at the heart of imperial philosophy. The entire structure of Zarathel's empire was built on the assumption that centralized intelligence could analyze complex situations and determine optimal responses. The idea that problems might be too complex for centralized solution was almost heretical. Give me an example, she said. Climate management, Dr. Martinez replied immediately. 50 years ago, human industrial activity was threatening to make our planet uninhabitable. A centralized authority might have imposed a single solution: reduce industrial output to sustainable levels. That would have prevented environmental collapse, but it would have also condemned billions of humans to poverty and suffering. President Wheeler continued the explanation. Instead, hundreds of different groups pursued thousands of different approaches simultaneously. Some worked on renewable energy technologies, others developed carbon capture systems, others created more efficient industrial processes. Some groups focused on changing human behavior through education and incentives, while others worked on technological solutions that would make environmental protection economically advantageous. Dr. Petrov picked up the thread. No single approach would have been sufficient. But the combination of thousands of approaches, most of them partially successful, created systemic changes that addressed the problem while maintaining economic prosperity. The inefficiency of the process was actually a strength, because it meant we weren't putting all our resources behind a single solution that might have failed. Zarathel tried to imagine managing a crisis through such a distributed approach. The uncertainty would have been unbearable. Without central coordination, how could anyone know whether the problem was being solved or whether resources were being wasted on ineffective approaches? But how do you know if your efforts are working? How do you coordinate between different groups to prevent duplication of effort or conflicting objectives? We don't always know, Secretary General Chen admitted. Sometimes we duplicate effort, sometimes groups work at cross purposes, sometimes we pursue approaches that turn out to be dead ends. But the system is self-correcting because successful approaches get copied and expanded while unsuccessful ones get abandoned. And the coordination happens naturally, Dr. Martinez added. When a group achieves a breakthrough, they share the information because they want recognition for their discovery. Other groups adopt successful techniques and improve upon them. The process creates innovation at a rate that would be impossible under centralized direction. Zarathel found herself thinking about the Vega sector crisis that was requiring her attention. The client species there was resisting imperial resource quotas, claiming they interfered with cultural practices. Standard imperial response would be to demonstrate superior force and demand compliance. If that failed, economic sanctions would be imposed. If those proved insufficient, military action would follow. But what if the human approach offered alternatives? What if the resistance indicated not defiance requiring punishment, but a mismatch between imperial requirements and local conditions requiring adjustment? How would you handle a situation where a local government insisted on maintaining practices that interfered with larger organizational goals? The humans exchanged glances, and Zarathel realized they understood she was describing an actual situation rather than a hypothetical example. President Wheeler answered carefully. First, we try to understand why the practices were important to them. There might be information we don't have about local conditions or cultural values. Second, we'd look for alternative approaches that might achieve the larger organizational goals without requiring abandonment of the local practices. And if no alternatives could be found? Then, we'd negotiate, Secretary General Chen said. We'd try to find compromises that partially satisfied both sets of requirements, or we'd look for ways the local group could contribute to organizational goals through different means. Dr. Petrov added, sometimes we discover that the larger organizational goals were based on incomplete understanding of the situation. Local resistance can be valuable feedback indicating that centralized planning didn't account for important variables. The concept of treating resistance as feedback rather than defiance was revolutionary to Zarathel's understanding of governance. Imperial doctrine held that resistance indicated insufficient information about the benefits of imperial citizenship, or inadequate demonstration of the consequences of defiance. But, what if resistance sometimes indicated that imperial policies were suboptimal for local conditions? What if negotiations fail? What if the local practices genuinely threaten the welfare of the larger organization? Then, we face difficult choices, Secretary General Chen acknowledged. Sometimes we have to accept that not every problem has a solution that satisfies everyone. We try to minimize harm while protecting the most important interests. President Wheeler nodded soberly. It's not a perfect system, Empress. We sometimes make wrong choices, and people suffer because of our decisions. But, the distributed nature of our decision-making means that wrong choices usually affect smaller populations and can be corrected more quickly. Dr. Martinez looked directly at Zarathel. The question isn't whether mistakes will be made. The question is whether you want mistakes to be made by a single authority affecting billions of people, or by many authorities affecting smaller populations with opportunities for correction and learning. The conversation was interrupted by an alert from Captain Yexai, transmitted directly to Zarathel through her communication implants. The situation in the Vega sector was deteriorating. The client species had declared independence from the Empire and was encouraging other systems to follow their example. Zarathel excused herself to take the communication privately, moving to another section of the space station where she could speak with her ship without the humans overhearing. Report, she commanded. Captain Yexai's image appeared in her visual field. Majesty, the Danebians have formally announced secession from the Empire. They claim imperial resource quotas are incompatible with their reproductive cycle and are demanding recognition as an independent system. 3 other client species in the sector have declared support for the Danebian position. The situation was more serious than Zarathel had realized. The Danebians were a critical source of rare minerals needed for imperial technology. Their rebellion could not be allowed to succeed without seriously damaging imperial capabilities. More importantly, if their secession was recognized, it would encourage similar movements throughout the Empire. What is Admiral Fexmar's assessment? He believes a show of force will bring the Danebians back into compliance. 1 battlecruiser in orbit above their homeworld should be sufficient to end the rebellion. Standard Imperial doctrine supported the Admiral's assessment. Overwhelming display of superior force had ended hundreds of previous rebellions with minimal casualties and clear demonstration that resistance was futile. But Zarathel found herself thinking about the human approach to conflict resolution. What if Danebian resistance indicated a genuine problem with imperial policy rather than simple defiance requiring punishment? What exactly are they claiming about their reproductive cycle? They say imperial mining quotas require them to work during their mating season, which occurs only every 7 years. They claim this is destroying their ability to maintain their population. Zarathel felt a chill of realization. Danebian physiology was unusual among galactic species, but imperial administrators had always assumed that work schedules could be adjusted to accommodate biological requirements without affecting overall productivity. If the mining quotas were actually interfering with species reproduction, the situation was far more serious than a simple trade dispute. Has anyone verified their claim about reproductive cycles? Admiral Fexmar considers it irrelevant, Majesty. Imperial quotas are based on planetary capacity, not local preferences. But, what if local preferences were based on biological necessities that imperial analysis had failed to understand? What if the Danebians were literally fighting for species survival rather than economic advantage? Zarathel made a decision that surprised even herself. Delay any military response. I want a full biological survey of Danebian reproductive requirements before we take action. Majesty, delay risks encouraging other systems to join the rebellion. And military action without understanding the root cause of the problem risks creating a larger crisis, Zarathel replied, echoing arguments she had just heard from the humans. She ended the communication and returned to the conference room, where the human delegation was waiting patiently for her return. Their expressions showed curiosity but no attempt to pry into Imperial business they hadn't been invited to share. "Forgive the interruption," she said, taking her place at the table. "A situation has developed that requires my attention, but your discussion of conflict resolution has given me new perspectives to consider." Secretary General Chen looked at her thoughtfully. "Would it be presumptuous to ask if you'd like to discuss the situation? Sometimes an outside perspective can be helpful, even for problems involving very different contexts." Zarathel considered the offer. Imperial doctrine prohibited discussing internal conflicts with alien species, but these humans had demonstrated insights that might prove valuable. More importantly, she found herself genuinely curious about how they would approach the Denebian situation. A client species is resisting Imperial resource quotas, claiming they interfere with biological necessities. My military advisors recommend a show of force to end the resistance. Based on your earlier comments, I assume you would recommend a different approach. Dr. Petrov responded immediately. "We'd want to verify their claims about biological necessities first. If their resistance is based on actual survival requirements rather than economic preferences, military force would be addressing the wrong problem." President Wheeler nodded in agreement. "And even if their biological claims are accurate, there might be alternative approaches that satisfy both Imperial resource needs and local biological requirements." Dr. Martinez added, "The key question is whether this is an isolated problem or an indicator that Imperial resource policies don't adequately account for species diversity across the Empire." The insight struck Zarathel with unexpected force. She had been thinking of the Denebian situation as an isolated crisis requiring local response. But what if it was a symptom of systematic problems with how the Empire managed biological diversity across hundreds of species? Imperial resource policies were based on standardized assessments of planetary capacity and species capability. The system was efficient and had worked well for 3 centuries. But efficiency required assumptions about normal ranges of species requirements, and those assumptions might be breaking down as the Empire expanded to include more diverse forms of life. If the biological claims prove accurate, and if similar problems exist on other worlds, how would you restructure resource policies to accommodate greater diversity without losing coordination across the Empire? Secretary General Chen smiled. "That's the kind of problem humanity faces constantly in managing relationships between different nations and cultures. Our approach is to establish broad principles that everyone can accept, then allow local implementation to vary based on local conditions." "Can you give me a specific example?" "Environmental protection," Dr. Martinez replied. "We have global agreements about reducing atmospheric pollution, but we allow individual countries to achieve those goals through different methods. Some countries focus on renewable energy development, others on efficiency improvements, others on changing industrial processes. As long as they meet the agreed-upon targets, we don't mandate specific approaches." President Wheeler continued the explanation. "The key is focusing on outcomes rather than methods. If your goal is obtaining needed resources from client worlds, there might be many different ways to achieve that goal without requiring identical approaches on every world." The concept challenged fundamental assumptions about Imperial administration. Standardized methods ensured predictable results and prevented local variations from creating inefficiencies or conflicts. But standardization also meant that policies optimized for typical situations might be suboptimal for unusual conditions. What prevents such a system from fragmenting into chaos? How do you maintain overall coordination when local implementation varies so dramatically? Dr. Petrov answered thoughtfully. "Communication and feedback. Local groups report on their progress toward shared goals, and successful local innovations get adopted by other groups facing similar challenges. The system evolves and improves over time because it incorporates lessons learned from diverse experiences." Zarathel found herself imagining an imperial administration that worked more like human civilization, diverse local approaches coordinated through information sharing rather than centralized control. The efficiency would be lower, but the adaptability might be higher. Problems like the Denebian situation might be prevented by systems that automatically adjusted to local conditions rather than imposing universal standards. Such a system would require fundamental changes to imperial administration. The transition period would be chaotic and, potentially dangerous. Secretary General Chan nodded seriously. Major systemic changes are always disruptive. But, sometimes the alternative is systemic collapse when existing approaches can no longer handle increasing complexity and diversity. The words resonated with concerns that had been growing in Zarathel's mind for decades. The Empire was becoming more difficult to manage as it expanded to include increasingly diverse species with different biological requirements, cultural values, and social structures. Problems that had been rare when the Empire was smaller were becoming more frequent and more complex. Perhaps the human model offered insights not just for resolving the immediate Danubian crisis, but for restructuring imperial administration to handle the challenges of governing a truly galactic civilization. But, implementing such changes would require convincing imperial administrators, military commanders, and client species that distributed authority could work better than the centralized control that had brought 3 centuries of peace and prosperity. The magnitude of the challenge was daunting, but, for the first time in years, Zarathel felt genuinely excited about the possibilities of governance rather than simply managing the responsibilities of power. The journey back to the Vega sector gave Zarathel time to process everything she had learned from humanity. The Dominions will move through hyperspace while she studied reports from the biological survey team she had dispatched to Deneb Prime. What they found validated her decision to delay military action and challenge 3 centuries of imperial administrative assumptions. The Danubians were not simply resisting imperial quotas for economic advantage. Their reproductive cycle was far more complex than imperial records indicated. Every 7 years, the entire adult population entered a synchronized mating phase that lasted 4 months. During this period, any significant stress or disruption could cause permanent reproductive failure for the affected individuals. The imperial mining quotas required continuous operation during the mating season, effectively sterilizing a significant portion of the population. Worse, the biological survey revealed that similar mismatches between imperial policies and local biological requirements existed on dozens of other worlds. The Empire's standardized approaches were slowly destroying the reproductive capacity of multiple client species. The problems had gone undetected because the affected species either lacked the political organization to resist effectively or had assumed that imperial policies were based on complete understanding of their biology. Dr. Veltar approached her in the observation lounge where she was reviewing the reports. Majesty, the implications are staggering. If we continue current policies, we may be inadvertently committing genocide against species that have been loyal imperial citizens for generations. Zarathel looked up from the data displays, feeling the weight of unintended consequences settling on her shoulders. How many species are affected? At least 47 show clear biological incompatibilities with current imperial policies. Probably more once we expand the survey to include psychological and cultural requirements rather than just reproductive biology. The scope of the problem was overwhelming. 47 species represented hundreds of billions of individuals whose lives were being damaged by policies designed to benefit the Empire as a whole. The irony was bitter. In trying to create a galactic civilization that served everyone's interests, she had created systems that were slowly destroying the diversity that made galactic civilization valuable in the first place. What would it take to restructure imperial administration along the lines suggested by the humans? Dr. Veltar activated a holographic display showing current imperial organizational structures. Complete reorganization of resource management, policy implementation, and administrative oversight. Instead of centralized quotas, we would need adaptive systems that could adjust requirements based on local conditions. Instead of standardized policies, we would need flexible frameworks that could accommodate biological and cultural diversity. How long for such a transition? Decades, Majesty. And the political resistance would be enormous. Every level of imperial administration would need to be retrained or replaced. Client species would need to develop new capabilities for local self-governance. Military doctrine would require fundamental revision. The enormity of the task was daunting, but Zarathel found herself thinking about Secretary General Chen's words about systemic collapse when existing approaches could no longer handle increasing complexity. The alternative to difficult change might be the gradual disintegration of the Empire as more species discovered that imperial citizenship threatened their survival. Captain Yexai's voice interrupted her thoughts through the ship's communication system. Majesty, we're approaching the Vega sector. Admiral Thexvar is requesting immediate consultation on military response to the Denebian rebellion. Tell the Admiral I'll meet with him on Deneb Prime. I want to speak with the Denebian leadership directly before making any decisions about military action. The captain's surprise was evident in his response. Majesty, Admiral Thexvar strongly advises against exposing yourself to potential hostilities. The Denebians have declared independence and may view your presence as an opportunity for hostage-taking or worse. Zarathel considered the warning. Standard Imperial doctrine would support the Admiral's concerns. Empress-level leadership should remain safely distant from local conflicts, directing responses through military and administrative subordinates. But her conversations with humanity had convinced her that direct engagement might yield insights that distant management could not provide. Inform Admiral Thexvar that I'll take appropriate security precautions, but I need to understand the Denebian perspective before deciding on responses. The Admiral met her personally as her shuttle landed on Deneb Prime's capital city. Thexvar's chitinous features showed clear concern as he briefed her on the situation during their transport to the government complex where Denebian leaders waited. Majesty, the Denebians are demanding recognition of independence, cancellation of resource quotas, and reparations for what they claim is damage to their population. They've gained support from 3 other species in the sector and are in communication with potentially sympathetic groups throughout the Empire. What sort of reparations? Medical support for individuals whose reproductive capacity has been damaged by stress during mining operations, plus resources to support population recovery programs. The economic impact would be significant, and granting their demands would encourage similar requests from other systems. Zarathel absorbed this information as their transport approached the Denebian government complex. The architecture was unlike anything else in the Empire, organic curves that seemed to flow from the landscape itself, with elaborate decorative elements that served no obvious functional purpose. She realized she had never seen Denebian architecture before, because Imperial installations on client worlds followed standardized designs that ignored local aesthetic preferences. The Denebian leadership waited in their council chamber, a circular room with acoustics designed to ensure that all voices could be heard equally. Premier Velnash, the elected head of their government, was a tall, graceful being whose silvery skin showed the subtle color changes that indicated emotional state among his people. His current coloration suggested controlled anger and deep concern rather than the defiance Zarathel had expected. Your Imperial Majesty, Premier Velnash began, his voice carrying the musical tones typical of his species, we welcome your presence, though we regret the circumstances that bring you to our world. Zarathel studied the Denebian leader, noting the careful formality that avoided either submission or outright challenge. Premier Velnash, I've come to better understand your concerns about Imperial policies. I've reviewed the biological survey results, and I want to hear your perspective on how these issues might be resolved. The Premier's skin shifted to a warmer tone that indicated surprise and cautious hope. Majesty, we appreciate your willingness to listen. We have served the Empire loyally for over a century, and we have no desire to leave Imperial protection. But we cannot accept policies that threaten our species' survival. Explain the specific impacts of current mining quotas on Denebian reproduction. Premier Velnash activated a holographic display showing Denebian population statistics over the past several decades. During our reproductive cycles, any significant stress triggers hormonal changes that can permanently damage fertility. Imperial mining quotas require continuous operation during our mating seasons, creating stress levels that have reduced our reproductive success by 60%. If current policies continue, our population will decline below sustainable levels within 3 generations. The data was stark and undeniable. Zarathel found herself wondering how such a critical issue had gone undetected by Imperial administrators for so long. Why wasn't this information provided to Imperial authorities when the policies were implemented? It was, Majesty. Our representatives submitted detailed biological data during the initial integration process. We were told that Imperial efficiency requirements could not accommodate species-specific variations, and that our biology would adapt to Imperial standards over time. Zarathel felt a chill of recognition. How many times had she heard similar assurances from administrators who believed that local problems would resolve themselves through the superior efficiency of imperial methods? How many species had submitted requests for accommodation that were dismissed as resistance to imperial improvements? Admiral Fexbar spoke for the first time since entering the council chamber. Premier Velnash, imperial policies are based on proven methods that have brought prosperity to hundreds of worlds. Local variations create inefficiencies that reduce benefits for everyone. The premier's skin shifted to a deeper tone that indicated frustrated determination. Admiral, prosperity means nothing if achieving it destroys the species being protected. We would rather live with less efficiency than face extinction through imperial improvement. The confrontation crystallized the fundamental conflict between imperial efficiency and local survival. Veltar, who had been quietly analyzing Denebian proposals, looked up from her datapad with obvious excitement. Actually, Admiral, the Denebian proposal might increase overall productivity. Intensive work periods followed by recovery periods often produce better results than sustained moderate efforts. And, the psychological benefits of knowing their species' survival was protected might increase Denebian efficiency significantly. Zarathel studied the faces around her, Admiral Fexbar's obvious skepticism, Dr. Veltar's scientific curiosity, Premier Velnash's desperate hope, and the watching Denebian officials whose futures depended on this conversation. She realized she was facing a choice that would define the future direction of imperial administration. She could maintain current policies and resolve the crisis through military force, preserving imperial efficiency at the cost of gradually destroying the diversity that made the empire valuable. Or she could experiment with the human approach of accommodating local requirements within flexible frameworks, accepting lower efficiency in exchange for sustainable relationships with client species. Premier Velnash, I'm prepared to authorize a trial period for your proposed accommodation. Denebian mining operations will be restructured to respect your reproductive cycles, with production targets adjusted to account for the seasonal changes. The premier's skin shifted to a brilliant gold that indicated overwhelming relief and gratitude. Majesty, your wisdom honors both our species and the Empire. We pledge that Denebian productivity will exceed previous levels once our people know their survival is protected. Admiral Fexbar's expression showed clear concern. Majesty, this precedent will encourage demands from other species throughout the Empire. Yes, Zarathel agreed. It will. And, we'll evaluate those demands on their individual merits, looking for accommodations that serve both imperial interests and local requirements. The conversation continued for several hours as they worked out implementation details, but Zarathel's mind was already moving beyond the immediate crisis to the larger implications of what she was starting. By the time they concluded negotiations, she had committed the Empire to a fundamentally different approach to governance, one that emphasized adaptation over control, diversity over uniformity, and collaboration over command. The return journey to Dominion Prime gave her time to prepare for the political resistance that would greet her decisions. Imperial administrators would argue that accommodating local variations would destroy the efficiency that had made the Empire successful. Military commanders would warn that appearing to yield to resistance would encourage rebellion throughout the Empire. Client species would debate whether requesting accommodations was worth the risk of imperial displeasure. But Zarathel found herself energized by the challenges ahead rather than daunted by them. For the first time in decades, she felt like she was building something rather than simply managing something. The Empire had achieved its original goals of bringing peace and prosperity to the galaxy. Now it was time to evolve toward goals that humanity had shown her: sustainable diversity, adaptive governance, and leadership that served the led rather than simply commanding them. Dr. Veltar found her in the observation lounge as they approached Dominion Prime, studying the reports that had accumulated during their absence. Majesty, preliminary analysis suggests that accommodation-based policies could improve imperial stability significantly. Species that feel their survival is protected are more likely to contribute enthusiastically to imperial goals. What about efficiency concerns? Short-term efficiency will decline as we restructure administrative systems. But long-term efficiency might actually improve as client species develop more productive relationships with imperial authorities. Zarathel looked out at the approaching lights of her capital world, where she would soon need to convince imperial leadership that radical change was necessary for long-term survival. The conversation would be difficult, because she was asking them to abandon proven